continues. We're trying as an exercise for ourselves to get an outline of Genesis by thinking about the chapters. That's one way, I guess, to look at these events. Starting with chapter 1 would be the 6 days of creation. Then chapter 2 would be man in the garden. Chapter 3 would be the fall. Chapter 4 would be the story of Canaan and Babel, I think. Some people word it different ways. Chapter 5 would be the generations from Adam to Noah. Chapter 6, the judgment upon man is pronounced there, the wickedness of man, and the call of Noah. And chapter 7 is the beginning of the flood, and chapter 8 be the end of the flood, and chapter 9 be after the flood. But that's where we are. We didn't quite finish up chapter 9, and we looked at the events that took place during that period, how that God indeed blessed Noah and commissioned him, made a covenant with him, that he was to, again, to fill the earth, and the prohibitions and allowances in terms of eating that were given there. But in reference to the promise that God made, we sometimes call it the Rainbow Covenant, Brother Walter used to call it. What was the Rainbow Covenant? Yes, sir.
The Lord would never again flood the earth like he did.
Yeah. Would never again destroy the earth by water. That's right. And what was the sign of that covenant given to man? The rainbow. God said, I will see it. Of course, accommodative language here. And I will remember. And every time we see it, we remember God remembering. And what a blessing that is. At the end of this chapter, in chapter 9, beginning at about verse 18, we find a sad event that took place here. And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. It's interesting how that he would note that. Actually, Ham had several sons, didn't he? We'll read about that in the next chapter. Canaan wasn't his oldest child, but that's the one that he mentions here. And I think maybe that gives us a clue as to why this is noted for us. These are the 3 sons that of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. Verse 20, and Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken. And he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon both their shoulders, went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, the servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem and of Canaan, and Canaan shall be his servant. And God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Curious passage, and one that's raised a lot of questions through the years, and I don't know that I have all the answers to it. What happened here? What we know is what we read here, that Noah was drunken. There's no moral judgment placed upon that. That doesn't mean that what he did was a good thing or a right thing. There's some smart folks who will argue that it was not unlawful to be drunken at this point. It certainly was later. At least, and though we don't have the law or the record of that, I don't think he did himself credit here. Some have suggested it was an accidental thing, that this was all so new. I don't know. Again, that's certainly not stated. The passage, just leaves us with some questions. One thing that I think I can say, and I believe we all would agree with this, is that it's another example of Proverbs 20 and verse 1, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging. They that are deceived thereby are not wise. what followed is not blamed upon Noah, but it certainly was a sad chapter that would not have happened had it not been for intoxication. We could make the same argument in reference to Lot in a few chapters. It was likewise under the influence of alcohol that terrible things happened. So, be that as it may, it's not Noah's actions that are so much focused on here. It's what happened after Noah is drunken, incapacitated, and vulnerable in his tent. What the text says is that Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. And there have been some rather creative, I think, explanations of this. One that I have heard more than one time is some connection with perhaps Leviticus 18. You remember, under the law of Moses, there's a prohibition here against sexual misconduct. Verse 6 of Leviticus 18, "And none of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father," the old translation reads, "or the nakedness of thy mother, thou shalt not uncover. She is thy mother, thou shalt not uncover her nakedness." So there have been some attempts to connect the events in Genesis 9 with something going on here, that perhaps there was some sort of sexual molestation of the father, or that the uncovering of the father's nakedness. You have another translation in verse 7 besides the King James. Anybody got the ESV? Okay, how's it read in verse 7? No, I'm sorry, this is Leviticus 18:7. I apologize.
Leviticus 18, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it.
18:7.
Yes, sir.
"You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness."
Yeah, where the King James reads, and some of the old translations read, "or the nakedness of thy father, or the nakedness of thy mother," there are those who will say, actually, the nakedness of thy father, that is to say that which belongs to the father, that is to say the wife. So they have tried to make this to be an incestuous situation, where there was, and some have gone so far as to suggest maybe even this child Canaan was born of that relation. Anyway, I hate to pollute the air with all kind of theories that I think are at best rather wild speculation. It seems pretty evident when we read the text in Genesis 9. It wasn't his wife that was uncovered. If she was, she's not mentioned. It was Noah that was uncovered. He was uncovered within his tent. The same fellow that got drunk was uncovered. And it was recognized by Noah after he sobered up somehow. Either his senses, memory came back to him, or somebody told him what happened, what had been done to him. So I don't really find that very convincing, some of the theories there that relate to that. I tell you, if I just take this text and I just look at it as being rather simply the idea that Ham, the son of Noah, came in, saw his father in a bad situation, and seemed to take some pleasure in it. He seemed to show great disrespect for his father. Not just for his father, but for the God of Noah as well. None of this is reverent. All of it is of evil. And that would seem to be enough. This blatant disrespect for God and his beloved is enough to merit the disfavor of the father. Let me pause there and then come back. Yes, sir.
It doesn't tell exactly, but I mean, there's so many things that just from the text itself, Noah wakes up and he's covered. How did I get covered? Well, Shem and Japheth did. Well, how did they know to do it? Well, Ham saw you and ran and told them. Well, what was Ham doing in the tent? Why didn't he take care of it? Why is he running and telling other people that this, that's another easy way to say that mean, this is a problem that happens a lot, that's talked about a lot in the Bible, even in the New Testament, talking about running and telling somebody else about one person's business, you know, involving people that don't necessarily need to be involved. The point to be made is it's a gossip kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, the point here is, it seems that because Shem and Japheth were the ones that covered him, and Ham didn't have anything to do with it, he didn't go asking them for help. He was going to tell them, just to tell them.
And I think that so many times, as you point out, when you look in the Scripture and you find an expression like love covers a multitude of sins, that's certainly not to say we're going to help them sin, but more the idea of we're not trying to fan the flames here. We're hoping to help them to repentance, for one thing. And we're also not interested, again, in just trying to besmirch somebody's reputation. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. Not trying to make it worse. Somebody else had a question about that. So, still, I guess, leaves the question, what is about why Canaan is singled out here? Not even Ham, but Canaan. Verse 25 again, cursed be Canaan is the result of what happened there. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. I don't know, again, maybe I'm missing something obvious here, but I'm not sure that the point is that Canaan will be cursed because of what Ham did. But what I see going on with Noah is a prophecy that we find with Isaac and with Jacob, famously in chapter 49 of Genesis, when we read there about his prophecy concerning his family. And this is what's going to happen to Reuben, and this is what's going to happen to Simeon and Levi. And so one way to look at this passage is Noah takes this occasion. This is not just it's not a wish. It's not even just a prediction, as much as it is an inspired prophecy about what will happen to this branch of the family of Ham. You know, Ham is arrogant and Ham is irreverent. But I will tell you that in Ham's family, you know, there'll be plenty of tears to be shed because of not just what happened on this day, but the choices that will be made. Sometimes, certainly, children suffer as a consequence of fathers. There's no question about that. I don't think the guilt follows them, but consequences follow. But if we walk in the steps, we certainly will find of that spirit. We will find our own pain that we brought upon ourselves. And that fits well Canaan, doesn't it? Again, you got to remember, who wrote the book of Genesis? And it was Moses who led the people to the land of Canaan. Not in it, but to it, for the purpose of taking that land. The promise that we'll read about in just a chapter or so about the iniquity of the Amorites coming full, Canaan would be cursed. And those that were not destroyed were cursed to be servants. Is it over in 1 Kings 9, I think it is? And we're talking about, well over a millennium later, during the days of Solomon. He talks about isn't that 1 Kings 9? Am I thinking right about that? Verse 20. And all the people that were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, those are the Canaanites, which were not of the children of Israel. Their children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel were not able to utterly destroy, upon them did Solomon levy a tribute of bond service unto this day. This prophecy, without question, came true. And it reflected, I think, the same kind of irreverent spirit. I'll tell you why those folks suffered the way they did. Because they did not respect Jehovah. They could have. Others did. So what we have, I think, in this passage is a sad story about Noah making himself vulnerable. One of his sons, we sometimes say, Noah was able to bring his family through the evils of his day. And yes, but when you look at Ham, you got to say, well, he didn't stay where he should have been, did he? So the point is that it's, I think, especially meaningful to those who first read this book. I don't know exactly when Moses wrote Genesis, but when he wrote it, he was writing to people who were about to face these Canaanites. And so I think that's the specific reason why in verse 18. Now remember, the Ham I'm going to tell you about, he's the father of these Canaanites. And they were cursed by Noah. Everybody knew Noah. So that, I think, is the power of it. And some of the details, frankly, I don't know that I can answer all the questions. Yes, sir.
Two things there. For one, I think this is what God means when he talks about punishing children for the iniquities of the fathers, because they're just following in their father's iniquities, their father's sins, and that's why they're being punished. I think that's kind of like when he talks about he's not going to do that anymore now, because now we're able to be free from the sins of our fathers by obeying.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, I think this and Lot kind of put to rest the idea that that you can be, just good enough and be fine. Noah's family was good. Noah was good, and his family was good enough not to be destroyed by the flood. But just good enough, and kind of coasting on that there. Well, what about Ham and his descendants? The same thing for Lot. Lot was good enough not to be destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. What happened right after?
Yeah.
It's not enough just to be good enough. We have to strive to be what God wants us to be.
If you want to defeat the devil, you got to lock the back door, don't you? That's for sure. He's always around. Thank you. Anybody else have a point about this part? Yes, sir.
When I've read Genesis, I've always, and I may have said, I may have thought, it may be wrong, but I've always said the Canaanites were cursed people because of what Noah's son Ham did. Am I saying that wrong when I say that?
Well, I think,
Because you never mentioned Ham's punishment, it was Canaan.
right. Although I think we could probably see that in the punishment of Canaan, there was a punishment to Ham, wasn't it? If his family was cursed, it wasn't something that came back on him. And I wouldn't say you're wrong, but I would say that when you think about why Canaan ultimately, for example, was wiped out, those tribes were by the Israelites, it wasn't what Ham did so many years ago. It was rather in reference to their own sins, wasn't it, and their own wickedness. So I guess I've always thought of this more as, I can't say there's not a connection. I think what he's saying is he's looking at Ham's sin and he's saying, your family, this branch of your family is a cursed branch. And there will be a lot of tears and suffering that will come to you. Your arrogance and your pride will be answered, in ways that you can't imagine right now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I think looking at that too, and I won't say much because I think, I don't know if you're going to touch on this or not, but on the other side of that, you have Shem and Japheth, and there's a prophecy made about them, and you see how they're blessed, and it just so happens, that they're, that how they treated their father was what should have been. They did the right thing then, and then it just, you got to imagine that their influence, just like you said, Ham seemed to be irreverent and just it was a bad point in his life. But those who descend from his descendants, as you pointed out, made bad choices themselves. But you see Shem and Japheth, that there will be those who come through them that will be greatly blessed.
Yeah. Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah. That is a point to make when he talks here about the blessing upon Shem and upon Japheth. There's an interesting note here in verse 27. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. We'll talk about these guys in a minute, but Japheth shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Again, that's been explained different ways. It does seem that Japheth will be blessed and enlarged, but what does it mean to dwell in the tents of Shem? One way that's been explained maybe has to do with the significance of Shem. What's the primacy of Shem? Why is Shem listed first, though he wasn't the oldest? Lineage of Christ. And so maybe the idea, some have connected it to a messianic prophecy here. I can't be sure about that. Question or point further? Appreciate that.
I've got to look at this Times Past was where Shem was the lineage of Christ. Japheth may have been the Gentiles, and at some point in time, they're going to dwell in the same tent together. Where the idea of they're no longer being just the Jews, but the Gentiles as well.
Yeah, messianic prophecy. That's right. That's right. That's possible. I don't know that it's ever quoted and referred to that way, but it's suggestive of that. Maybe there's another explanation better. Verse 28 tells us about the death of Noah. Noah lived after the flood 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. The old patriarch lived longer than Adam did, but eventually he likewise left this life. And what you find beginning in chapter 10 is what's sometimes called the Table of Nations, the history of Noah's sons, maybe. Now, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem and Ham and Japheth. Unto them were born sons after the flood. So, here's the story of the human family after it expands. We start off with Japheth. As you look at these verses, some of these are not familiar names, but some of them may be. In verse 2 there, Gomer, Magog, Madai. Anybody recognize that or have a footnote about that? Okay, well, that's probably Magog. But Madai, yes, sir.
Well, maybe I'm wrong on that, but the Midianites eventually?
Pardon?
Is that the source of Midian? Where Midian originated?
I don't think Midian. No, I think this may be, something sounds like that, though. The Medes, aren't they connected with the Medes? Yeah, which we think of maybe later on and as they joined up with the Persians, and there's the history of Esther and so the return. So the Medes, okay, Javan. Anybody got another footnote there? That's a word for Greece. Yeah, so that's a word related to that. In Daniel, it's translated Grecia several times. So we're just getting a sense of maybe where some of these folks wound up as things went on. Verse 5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now that's interesting. You'll find a phrase like that last phrase there, in reference to all of these families. He talks about a time when people would be divided. And we haven't read about that yet, have we? Not the narrative of it. That's what chapter 11 is about, I think, the dividing. But this genealogy, this history, assumes that we know about that. Then he comes back in the next chapter to tell us about it. I think that's rather obvious, but if I don't recognize that, it's going to make this very confusing. But I think chapter 10 is going to incorporate in it the fact, yes, that the nations were divided, and then this is the aftermath of that. And then he comes back in 11 and says, well, let me tell you about that dividing. They were divided in tongue, family, and nation. Somebody suggested they were divided linguistically, sociologically, and politically. That's a pretty good way to say that, I think. The same is true about the family of Ham. Cush, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Eventually, we associate Cush in the Bible with what nation? Ethiopia. Not necessarily the modern borders, but including that area of the world. Yeah. Mizraim. What is Mizraim? Egypt, I think. Yeah, I think that's true. Canaan, of course. We know about Canaan, don't we? Sheba is mentioned here. Remember the Queen of Sheba. I think that's the same basic reference there. But of course, we're not that far away at this point. Initially, where was everybody after the flood? They were in the land of Shinar. They were there at the foot of Mount Ararat, or the mountains of Ararat. That's where they were. And they eventually were divided and spread. But there's an interesting story here in verse 8. Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Let me pause to make a quick point that I'm sure you know. When he talks about him being a mighty hunter, I don't think about a guy who's got several deer heads mounted on his wall. This is not sport, is it? When you think about a hunter, I think it's more maybe to the point to say here is someone who is a great protector, great with weapons, able to protect people from wild animals. They gather around him and look to him for guidance. So he's a leader. Not just in terms of animals hunting, sport, but in terms of protection as a great warrior, as a great political leader, as he goes on to say here. And let me read this quickly and then we'll get your questions. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And out of that land went forth Assur, and builded Nineveh, and the cities of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. And he continues there. So you have a little glimpse of the civilization that was built after the days of Noah. Great cities were built, great leaders. Nimrod is mentioned first as being a great founder and leader. The question, I guess, that might be asked is, they were powerful men. They were influential men. Were they godly men? That would seem to be very questionable considering what comes next. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, this seems to be the start of what, you might remember the song, Cult of Personality. That type of person. This is the first one, first one of the descendants that's listed as a kingdom, having a kingdom. And so the type of person, the mighty man that draws others to him. And, throughout history, as you might know, those people tend to have a pretty high view of themselves. That same type of thing that makes them that charismatic leader also kind of seems to, in general, produce a type of pride and an arrogance to them. And as we know, both of those things are not very conducive to following the Lord.
Yeah. It's a great challenge to be able to be in a position like that and still be subject to God. Not impossible, but you're right, that's very different. So, you have, again, the Canaanites are mentioned here, and we know about them and their later history. And then he talks about, again, how in verse 20, ultimately the sons of Ham were divided after families, tongues, and countries in their nations. But it seems to me that those divisions came not at the first, but after the results of chapter 11. And then the descendants of Shem. Have a little image of that family. And again, some of these names are not as familiar as others. We do read down in verse 25, unto Eber. And again, that name is some question about its etymology, but some think of it in reference to being a foreigner. Others think that the very word Hebrew maybe goes back, if not to this man, at least to the same concept of the name. But Eber had two sons, and one of them was named Peleg. Peleg means, as your little note may say, division. Because, notice, in his days, verse 25, in his days was the earth divided. Well, that sounds like the events of chapter 11. Now, there's some who might make an argument against that, and I'll just leave it there, but I've always thought of that being maybe a pretty strong reference to that, though there may be some arguments against it. So, he's giving us this big picture of the world and the descendants of all of these nations and where they all came after the flood. These are the families, verse 32 ends up the story of Noah, the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations. By these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. We can concentrate on the division, and that's an obvious thing to concentrate on. But one thing we'd have to note is the fact that all of these nations came from where? One family. Doesn't that remind you a little bit of what Paul wrote, but he said, and Luke recorded it, when he was preaching there at Mars Hill in Athens. He's talking about the Lord, the God, the Creator. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, yet He is not actually far from each of us. What a great thought that is. And how that changes the world. You know, we have our own groups, and we say, well, I'm an American, or I'm a this or that or something else. The truth is we're human. We're all made in the image of God, and we are a whole lot more alike than we are different. And the divisions that have come, he tells us just a little bit about here. But the major point is we are all the children of God. And we ought to think of that as being our primary purpose on the earth, whoever we are, wherever we are, to be a servant of that Creator. Somebody had a point of thought. Yes, sir.
You know, what's interesting when you look at the genealogies, or this genealogy, do you know something that's missing? How long they lived, you know, you go back to Genesis 5, it told you. And so, but I think you see a shift, a difference in purpose, where things are. And I guess, you know, God letting us know in you know, how long people live, you know, it gives us a sense of, you know, in our thinking, you know, how could you accomplish this if, you know, if people had the same, you know, lived as long as we do, like that couldn't be. But when they lived to be 900 plus years and all these things, yes, it's very possible. But now we see where the ages are going down rapidly, I think.
Yeah. Of course, in chapter 11, he's going to tell us, but he's not interested in all the families and all the histories, is he? He's giving us a little overview in chapter 10. But then in chapter 11, when he focuses on that one family, he's certainly going then to say a little more about what you're talking about there. And I think you're right. It does ultimately show us that men were not intended forever to live 900 years, were they? So, yeah. Yes, sir.
I was going to say that the other thing, you know, a lot of the other retort I will see from people talk about, you know, one incestuous family, you know, spread out and fill the earth, and how could that be possible? And, you know, well, the problem, the way it is now, you know, is any mutations or errors in your DNA get concentrated in a family because people in families tend to share those. Back then, you know, I think, people lived so
Yeah, God had his purpose, didn't he, in his way. So chapter 11 goes back now and explains about this division. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech, it begins. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain of the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And so they had brick for stones, and slime they had for mortar. These building materials, let me just pause quickly. I don't know much about building. Some of you guys know a lot about it. But the idea is that these fire bricks that they had made would be much more durable and workable than some of the, allow them to build higher than some of the natural materials they had, and also that the asphalt type of joining compound would be very useful to them, so that they could accomplish more than they had before. They're growing in their knowledge of these material possessions. And what do they want to do? Verse 4, they say, Let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto the heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So just quickly, verse 4, what is it they plan to do? Yeah, build a city, build a tower, make a name for ourselves. What did God told Noah's family to do? Fill the earth. So it seems that the whole thing here is based upon human wisdom and not God's instruction. And that's, where is this going? Where is this road head? Where does this road lead?
Back where they were.
Back where they were. Back to the mess that God freed them from to start with. So, God came down to see the city and the tower and that the men built it. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one. They have one language. They began this to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them. You know where this is going. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. This was the original one world order, right? And I tell you, every time people talk like that, it just sends a chill down your spine, because you know good and well that men with their wisdom getting together does not lead people to God. It leads to disaster. And God could see that. He knew that, certainly. And so he said, verse 7, Let us go down and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And so God scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. I want to make this simple. There are a lot of questions. He doesn't explain any more than what he says here about God confounding. Verse 7. You got the word for confound there? Confuse. I think the original word means can be translated to tangle, to perplex, to mix. Somehow God in a way that he doesn't specify. One day all these folks speak the same language and understand. The next day nobody understands what the next guy's saying. And they go off into these groups, because those are the people that I can communicate with. And God has this ingenious way of dividing men. Now, here's the question that I need to consider. Is this a curse or a blessing? He's blessing them. What's he doing? How's it a blessing? Saving them from themselves, exactly. So, that's another way to look, I think, at the tower. It's not God cursing men so much as it is God saving man from his own evil designs, saving them from the consequence they would no doubt bring upon themselves. He had already promised he would not destroy the earth again by water. This is one way God keeps that promise. Yes, sir.
Well, the other thing, funny you should bring that up, because I'm looking back at that. What does he say when he says that? He says the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. And so now what does he say when he talks about it in verse 6? Now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. There's not going to be anything to stop those evil evil imaginations from flowing forth again.
Right.
That's the link here that he's got to that. A lot of people are like, does he mean that they'll be powerful enough that he can't stop them? No. That's not what God says. This them starting a thing where this is built on disobeying what God has said. This entire thing is built on disobeying what God has said, and if they just keep going this way, it's going to keep going that way.
Yeah. Every parent in this room can relate to this. God is the ultimate Father. And he just, our parents know this is not going to be good for you. And I'm going to have to do something to keep you from getting hurt here. That's what God does for mankind in this passage. You have then the history in the latter part of this chapter from Shem to Abraham. Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu. Peleg, that was when the earth was divided, according to that statement. Reu, Zerah, Nahor, Terah, and Abram. It's an exercise maybe that you might want to add to your list here. Of the list that I want to just get that genealogy from Adam to Abraham and the names that he's giving, following that line there. Because that really is the significance of this, isn't it? Pretty quickly when you think about it. I mean, God has covered, a couple of thousand years of history in 11 chapters. He's not interested in many things that went on. There were a lot of things that happened. But quickly the Bible goes from creation and sin and the promise of redemption to the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise in Abraham. But it's through the family of Terah that we see this special family come about. We'll say just a word about the latter part of chapter 11, and then we'll get into the story of Abraham. Chapter 12, Lord willing, next time. Thank you so much for all your participation, your help, your encouragement, and we'll pick up there next time.